In the heart of West Africa, a silence was broken by a single rumor. Several members of France's intelligence service, the DGSE, had been detained in Burkina Faso. The arrests came just as relations between Paris and Ouagadougou were reaching their lowest point. France's troops expelled, its influence fading, and a young military leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, determined to draw a line in the sand. Inside the French intelligence community, concern turned quickly to planning. A proposal surfaced. A helicopter extraction, swift and discreet, designed to bring the captured agents home. But the plan leaked, and from Ouagadougou, the message was unambiguous. Traoré's government warned that any foreign aircraft entering Burkinabè airspace without permission would be treated as hostile and shot down. For the DGSE, the mission suddenly shifted from a tactical dilemma to a geopolitical gamble. Could France risk open confrontation just to save its own spies, or had its era of control in the Sahel already ended? Subscribe as we uncover the tension, the secrecy, and the fragile pride behind one of France's most delicate standoffs in Africa. For decades, France's shadow had stretched across the Sahel, from Mali to Niger, and deep into Burkina Faso. Officially, it was the legacy of cooperation, counterterrorism, development aid, training. But beneath the surface, it was a delicate balance of dependency and resentment. French advisors, soldiers, and intelligence officers operated freely, protected by old alliances forged after independence. That balance broke when Captain Ibrahim Traoré seized power in Burkina Faso. He promised a new era, one free from what he called the arrogance of foreign masters. Within months, the French ambassador was recalled, military agreements suspended, and Russian military instructors began to appear in Ouagadougou. The tone of the relationship changed overnight. After France's military withdrawal from the Sahel, what remained were small networks of DGSE operatives, intelligence specialists, tasked with monitoring jihadist movements and safeguarding French nationals. Officially, they were security consultants. In reality, they were spies working in one of the most hostile environments France had ever faced. The incident began quietly. According to sources close to both governments, a group of DGSE personnel was stopped at a checkpoint on the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Their identification did not match their declared purpose, and their movements raised suspicion. Within hours, they were detained and transferred to a secure facility under military control. Burkina Faso's state media said nothing. The arrests were handled in complete secrecy, a message that Traoré's regime understood the power of silence. In Paris, however, the news hit like a thunderclap. Within the DGSE headquarters in Boulevard Mortier, the realization set in. Several of their own were being held by a government that no longer trusted France and perhaps no longer feared it. Officials scrambled to verify the details. Had their cover been blown? Were the detainees on a legitimate mission? Or had they been caught gathering intelligence on Burkina Faso's new alliances? The answers were murky. Inside the Élysée Palace, President Emmanuel Macron was briefed that the situation was highly sensitive. There were immediate concerns about escalation. France still maintained a fragile presence across the Sahel, in Niger, in Chad, and a confrontation with Burkina Faso could ignite anti-French sentiment across the region. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré's inner circle saw the arrests differently. They were proof that France's influence was no longer untouchable. A close advisor to the captain, quoted by a Burkinabè journalist, reportedly said, "They used to operate here as if they owned the place. Those days are over." For days, no official statement came from either side. Diplomats exchanged encrypted messages, intelligence channels went dark, but behind the scenes, French operatives began planning what the government could not publicly admit: an extraction. The logic was simple. If negotiations failed or the detainees were moved, France might lose them forever. The challenge was immense. They would have to fly into a hostile capital, land undetected, extract their people, and leave before radar or anti-aircraft units could react. Every kilometer of airspace had become politically radioactive, and above it all hung the same question. Was this still about saving agents or saving face? The DGSE knew that a failed rescue would humiliate Paris and strengthen Traoré's narrative of sovereignty, but doing nothing would signal weakness, confirming to the entire Sahel that France had lost its nerve. As rumors spread through diplomatic circles, one truth became clear. Burkina Faso had no intention of releasing the detainees quickly. The silence was strategic, a reminder that, for the first time in decades, France was no longer the one setting the terms. And in that silence, plans began to take shape in Paris, plans that would test not just military capability, but the limits of political will. In a windowless room at DGSE headquarters in Paris, maps of Burkina Faso lay spread across a long oak table. Every contour, every possible landing site, every radar range was marked in red. The plan, still in its infancy, carried the code name of a desert bird, a metaphor for how quietly they hoped to enter and leave. The idea was simple in outline, impossibly complex in execution. A small team would fly in under the cover of darkness, extract the detained agents, and return to friendly airspace before anyone could react. The Sahel, however, is not kind to precision. Its wind is unpredictable. Its terrain vast and uneven. The dust of the Harmattan blinds sensors and pilots alike. Helicopters that can hover in urban Europe struggled to climb in the thin, dry air above Ouagadougou. Logistics alone would stretch the limits of French special forces, and all this before the first bullet was fired. Still, for a few tense days, the plan advanced. Simulations were run, flight hours calculated, fuel requirements measured to the last drop. The operation would need at least 3 helicopters, 1 decoy aircraft, and refueling support mid-air. Every variable depended on the most fragile of assumptions, that they could enter and leave before anyone noticed. Yet, this was not the first time a nation had contemplated such a mission. History, especially in the world of intelligence, is filled with rescue operations that became legend and cautionary tale. Back in the 1970s, Israeli commandos stormed an airport in Uganda to rescue more than 100 hostages. The Entebbe raid became a textbook example of precision and courage, proof that a small, well-planned strike could rewrite the odds. But only a few years later, the United States tried something similar in Iran, Operation Eagle Claw. Sandstorms, engine failures, and poor coordination turned the mission into disaster. The images of burning helicopters in the desert haunted Washington for decades. France itself had known both pride and pain in such efforts. During a hostage crisis in Somalia, DGSE commandos attempted to rescue one of their own from al-Shabaab militants. The mission went wrong almost from the start. The hostage was killed, 2 soldiers died, and Paris was left explaining a failed operation on foreign soil. These precedents echoed through every conversation in the French war room. Each showed what was at stake. Success could reaffirm France's prestige. Failure could destroy it. And yet, there was one more layer of complexity that Entebbe and Eagle Claw never faced: the politics of a post-colonial region. After France's withdrawal from the Sahel, every inch of Burkinabè soil had become symbolic. The French flag no longer flew there. Any military incursion, even for a rescue, risked being read as invasion. Still, DGSE strategists pressed on. Satellite images were reviewed. Potential landing zones were modeled on digital maps. School fields, construction sites, riverbanks. The DGSE even consulted meteorologists for data on seasonal wind patterns. Timing was everything. The helicopters would need to cross hundreds of kilometers, refuel mid-air, land undetected, extract, and return before dawn. But even in simulation, the odds looked grim. Burkina Faso's air defenses, though limited, were on constant alert. Russian technicians had reportedly been assisting the Burkinabè military with radar calibration. There were whispers, never confirmed, that short-range anti-aircraft systems had been deployed near the capital. More worrying still was the political landscape. Traoré's government had publicly warned that the era of foreign operations on its soil was over. Any aircraft entering Burkinabè airspace without authorization would be treated as a hostile target. And when that warning came from the country's own head of state, the meaning was clear. A French helicopter would not just risk mechanical failure, it would risk being shot down. Inside the DGSE, the mood shifted from determination to calculation. Every discussion came back to one word: consequences. Yes, the operation could be done. Yes, it might save their people. But what then? Would Traoré retaliate by arresting more French nationals? Would it ignite anti-French protests across the Sahel? Would Paris be forced into a confrontation it could neither control nor justify? The generals spoke in terms of success rates, fuel ranges, and extraction windows, but the real battle was political. For every hour of tactical preparation, there were days of diplomatic hesitation. The mission that began as a rescue was slowly turning into a crisis of identity, a test of how far France was willing to go to defend its agents in a region where its power was already in retreat. And as the plans became more detailed, as the simulations grew more convincing, one message from Ouagadougou grew louder, repeated by every Burkinabè official who dared to speak off record: if they come for them, they will not leave our sky alive. The line between courage and catastrophe had never been thinner. And still, in the quiet corridors of Paris, the question lingered. Was the risk worth the rescue, or was France about to fly into the storm of its own making? In Ouagadougou, the air was thick with conviction. Flags no longer bore the same weight of allegiance. Speeches no longer echoed the tone of gratitude. Under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso was rewriting its story, and this time, France was not the author. To his supporters, Traoré was more than a soldier. He was a symbol, the face of a continent tired of being told what freedom should look like. He had risen through the ranks as a pragmatic officer, but in power he became something else, a voice for a generation that believed Africa must stand alone or never stand at all. When news reached him that French intelligence officers were detained, his response was calm, deliberate, almost ceremonial. To him, it was not a crisis. It was confirmation, proof that the old empire still could not let go. And when whispers of a rescue operation surfaced, his words struck like a thunderclap. Any aircraft that violates our airspace will be considered an act of aggression. And we will respond as any sovereign nation must. Those words traveled farther than any bullet. They carried the sound of a continent remembering its voice. Across the Sahel, people listened. In cafes in Bamako, in markets in Niamey, in the villages along the old French supply roads, there was a murmur, half pride, half disbelief. Someone finally had drawn a line. Here, the story turned from politics to principle. Because for Traoré, sovereignty was sacred. It was not a slogan to be chanted, nor a policy to be debated. It was the ground beneath his feet, the inheritance of those who had fought for independence, and the promise to those who would inherit his flag. He spoke of it not as diplomacy, but as creed. We are not against France. We are against submission. Our skies, our soil, our people. They are not for rent. It was the kind of language that carried both danger and power. For every Burkinabè soldier hearing those words, it was validation. For every French analyst listening from afar, it was a warning. In Paris, those words echoed through corridors of polished restraint. Inside the Ministry of Defense, some dismissed them as theater, a populist's performance, one diplomat called it. But others recognized something deeper. After France's withdrawal from the Sahel, a vacuum had formed, not only of troops, but of moral authority, and Traoré had filled it. Within the DGSE, the analysis was grim. Burkina Faso might not have had the capacity to challenge France militarily. But it had something more dangerous, legitimacy in its defiance. A single shot at a French aircraft, even if symbolic, would turn Traoré into a continental hero and France into the aggressor. And that realization rippled outward. From Algiers to Abidjan, African leaders watched closely. For decades, the unwritten rule of power in Francophone Africa had been simple. France could intervene, and no one would challenge it. Now, a captain from Ouagadougou had broken that rule, not with an army, but with a sentence. In the streets of Burkina Faso, murals began to appear. Traoré in uniform, his fist raised high beside the words, "Our land, our sky, our future." For his supporters, this was not just defiance, it was redemption. The idea that a young leader could stare down a former colonial power and force it to hesitate became proof of a new kind of freedom. But power built on conviction is volatile. Inside the French embassy, intelligence officers watched crowds march with Traoré's portrait, shouting for the expulsion of every French institution still left on Burkinabè soil. Diplomats urged restraint, generals called for contingency plans. And once again, Paris found itself facing a truth it did not wish to name, that in this new era, moral force could outweigh material might. As one French analyst later put it, "We lost not because we were weaker, but because we were no longer believed." Traoré understood this perfectly. Every speech, every declaration was designed not only for Burkina Faso, but for the region, to remind the Sahel that sovereignty, once reclaimed, must be defended like faith. In his eyes, this was not defiance. It was duty. And that belief, more than any weapon, was what made his warning so potent. For France, the message was clear. Burkina Faso was no longer terrain to be crossed. It was a border of principle. And as Paris hesitated, weighing risks against pride, the crisis moved quietly from the battlefield to the boardroom, from the skies above Ouagadougou to the offices of power in the Élysée. Because when sovereignty becomes sacred, every decision becomes a test of faith. And the question for France was no longer whether it could act, but whether it still had the right to. In Paris, the war room grew quieter. What began as a mission of precision was turning into a crisis of confidence. The DGSE had completed its assessments, flight paths, extraction zones, contingency plans. Everything was ready, at least on paper. But readiness meant little when the political climate outside the building was collapsing. President Macron's advisors were split. The military urged action. They argued that the DGSE's men had served the Republic. Leaving them behind would send a dangerous signal that France no longer protected its own. But the diplomats, especially those in the Quai d'Orsay, warned of disaster. One incursion, they said, could destroy what little influence France still had in West Africa. "We cannot fight for prestige," one official remarked, "when the battlefield is already lost." Inside the DGSE, the tension was palpable. Senior officers spoke in the language of loyalty and honor. One of them, according to a journalist later briefed on the debate, said simply, If we don't bring them home, we don't deserve to send anyone out again. But even among the intelligence ranks, fear was creeping in. The operation's risk assessments, thick folders of maps, probabilities, and coded warnings, painted a grim picture. At least a 60% chance of interception, one scenario read. Unknown anti-air capabilities, another noted. And worst of all, the likelihood that even if the agents were recovered, the international fallout would be catastrophic. Traoré's warning had done its job. For the first time in decades, a former French colony had forced Paris to hesitate. Not out of logistics, but out of legitimacy. In a late-night meeting at the Élysée, the room reportedly fell into a long, heavy silence after a general outlined the final operational timeline. Someone, no one could later remember who, asked the question that stopped everything. If this fails, who will explain to the nation why we lost men in a country that expelled us? There was no answer. That night, the coded order went out. Operation suspended until further notice. The helicopters stayed grounded. The teams stood down. And the plan? The weeks of reconnaissance, the simulations, the quiet confidence, vanished into the archives. The next morning, French newspapers spoke vaguely of ongoing negotiations. Officially, the government denied any rescue plan had ever existed. Unofficially, within the corridors of the DGSE, the mood was something far heavier than disappointment. It was the feeling of a door closing, not just on the mission, but on an era. Old Africa, hands within the agency, whispered about the change they'd felt coming for years. France was no longer the unquestioned power in the Sahel. The coups in Mali, Niger, and now Burkina Faso had rewritten the geography of influence. The flags had changed. The loyalties had shifted. Where once French intelligence operated with quiet confidence, now it moved with hesitation. And yet, as one senior officer admitted off record, the hardest part wasn't losing the operation. It was accepting that France had been warned and had obeyed. In the logic of power, submission is rarely visible in defeat. It hides instead in the absence of action. In the silence after the last meeting, in the aircraft that never took off, the decision to cancel was, in many ways, rational. But in the eyes of those who had built their careers on intervention, it was unbearable. They had always believed France could act first and justify later. Now, justification came before courage. And as news quietly spread through diplomatic channels that the helicopters would remain grounded, even allies took note. A European defense attaché in Dakar was overheard saying, "If Paris won't defend its spies, who will it defend?" In the world of intelligence, perception is power. And perception was slipping away. For the first time, France's silence spoke louder than its presence. When silence replaced strategy, diplomacy took the stage. France, having shelved its rescue operation, began searching for a different path, one that would save its captured agents without provoking another standoff. At first, Paris turned to the United Arab Emirates, hoping its growing influence in the Sahel might open a discreet channel, but the effort yielded little. The Burkinabè government, proud and unbending under Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was unwilling to negotiate through partners it viewed as distant or aligned with Western interests. So France looked elsewhere, to a country that had both respect and access inside Ouagadougou. That country was Morocco. It was not a random choice. Many Burkinabè officers, including Traoré himself, had received training in Moroccan academies. The captain often praised Morocco's stability and economic model, describing it as an African success built by Africans. Behind those gestures of admiration, French analysts saw opportunity. Morocco's intelligence service, the DGED, the General Directorate for Studies and Documentation, Morocco's Foreign Intelligence Agency, roughly equivalent to France's DGSE, already maintained information-sharing ties with Burkina Faso's National Intelligence Agency, ANR. Its director, Captain Oumarou Yabré, had studied at France's own Saint-Cyr Military Academy and received DGSE mentorship early in his career. To Paris, that personal network offered a way back into dialogue, without open confrontation. In the months that followed, subtle moves unfolded. President Emmanuel Macron reached out to King Mohammed VI of Morocco, sending a private letter that praised the kingdom's regional stability and reaffirmed France's support for Morocco's position in Western Sahara. It was, insiders later said, the price of access. Around the same period, senior Moroccan intelligence officials made several quiet visits to Ouagadougou. Each trip was described publicly as part of a bilateral cooperation framework. But behind closed doors, the agenda centered on one issue: the quiet release of the French detainees. Morocco, trusted by Traore and respected across North and West Africa, was the perfect bridge, and Rabat played the role with skill. After rounds of discreet negotiation, a breakthrough came. Burkina Faso agreed to free the prisoners. A Moroccan aircraft, a Bombardier Challenger under DGED authority, was dispatched to Ouagadougou. In the stillness of night, the detained French agents boarded the plane. They did not fly to Paris, but to Casablanca, where they underwent medical and psychological evaluation before reuniting with their families. In the days that followed, Morocco approved a new package of aid for Burkina Faso: military support, logistics, and training programs valued at tens of millions of euros. No public statement linked the two events, but everyone understood. For the DGSE, it was a quiet success, the kind that would never be spoken of publicly, but remembered in the hallways of Boulevard Mortier. They had done what they always did best: disappear behind the result. France, on the other hand, had achieved its objective, but through the channels of another power. It was Morocco that carried the message, Morocco that landed the plane, and Morocco that earned the gratitude. In the discrete world of intelligence, symbolism matters. And the symbolism was clear. The DGSE could still deliver, but no longer on France's terms. Across Africa's diplomatic circles, the message was unmistakable. France's age of unilateral command was over. From this point on, even the rescue of its own agents required another nation's hand. The story of the captured agents and the rescue that never took flight will likely never appear in any official DGSE archive, but in the quiet exchanges between embassies, in the unspoken deals that bridge politics and pride, it stands as one of the most revealing episodes of France's modern history in Africa. It showed how power evolves, how it shifts from helicopters to handshakes, from orders to negotiations, and how the fate of nations can turn not on what is done, but on what is withheld. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the episode was more than a diplomatic skirmish. It was vindication. His defiance had forced one of the world's most established powers to pause, to measure its actions against the sovereignty of a state once ruled by it. In the eyes of many Africans, that alone was victory enough. For France, it was a reckoning, a recognition that the Sahel it once mapped, governed, and patrolled had changed beyond recall. The agents returned home alive, but the aura of certainty that once surrounded French intervention did not return with them. As analysts across the region noted, Morocco's mediation had not only saved lives, it had redrawn influence. Rabat emerged as the quiet power broker of the Sahel, a role once unquestioningly reserved for Paris. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's image only grew stronger. the young officer who faced down a superpower and made it yield without firing a shot. And so the headlines that followed, the quiet acknowledgments, the murmurs in diplomatic circles, the subdued tone of every Burkina Faso news report, told the same story, the end of an era and the birth of another. Because in this new Africa, Traore represents something more enduring than defiance. He represents the idea that power can change hands, not through war, but through conviction. Perhaps that is why, long after the helicopter stayed grounded and the dust settled, this story still resonates. It reminds us that strength is not always about who dares to act, but who can afford to wait. What do you think, viewers? Was France wise to step back? Or did it surrender a legacy built over generations? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more untold stories behind the shifting power lines of modern Africa.